Want to use a PGR in your cereals but have no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as one tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
We're going to talk about a number of very, very important issues to farmers really across the country. And this has to do with a lot of this is centered around the PMRA and what is happening on a number of consultations. Here to chat about it is Mac Ross. He is VP for Trade Policy and Crop Protection with Canada Grains Council. Hey, Mac, great to have you on the show.
Hey, Sean, great to see you.
Yeah, so there's some of this is very there's a lot of granular detail. So we're going to try to increase people's understanding of what's actually at work here because these are things that sound like they're very far away from the farm, very technical, but depending on how these things go or I guess advance, it can really have an impact at what farmers are able to do in their own operations. So let's talk about the PMRA transformation. This has been going on for quite some time. What is the update? Where are we at with this process?
Sure, and maybe it's helpful to start with a bit of context, kind of regarding the at least the Canada Grains Council and across the industry, folks who work in this area. We've At the council, we've always had two primary focus areas when it comes to our work on crop protection. Domestic and international. So domestic, it's advocating for policy that provides Canadian farmers with access to new and innovative crop protection products. And internationally, it's working to ensure that the use of those products don't limit market access. So, I'd say historically that much of this work of the council and the industry largely fell into that second international bucket, where essentially we were worried that we could lose access to crop protection tools here in Canada solely due to what our trading partners were doing, as we're such an export dependent sector. And that's why, we have Keep It Clean, et cetera. And while the international facet of this work is still a big priority, and we're still very active in that space, now over the past couple of years, we've seen a bit of a shift when it comes to our focus on this file. And that work and focus has shifted more to our own domestic policy and concern that our own government could be moving to a policy and regulatory environment that restricts access to a full suite of crop protection tools for Canadian farmers. So, just for a bit of an update and maybe some additional context on PMRA transformation, as you had touched on there. So essentially, this all started about 3 years ago, in which you'll recall that was an election year. And I'll say that we've had our concern internationally with a divergence from science-based decision making within some of our trading partners, but in Canada we've never had a concern that the PMRA would lower the science firewall, so to speak. Right? They're very science and risk based, one of the best regulatory agencies in the world in that realm. But about 3 years ago, there was an announcement by three ministers proposing some big changes to the pesticide regulatory framework in Canada, which seemed to be quite politically driven. So the first time we wondered if there were some cracks in the armor as far as that science firewall around the PMRA, and this announcement had some minor positives, but the majority of it was concerning. It put a scientifically unjustified pause on the proposed increases to maximum residue limits, including for glyphosate. It also created a new expert panel process to provide scientific advice to the PMRA. And, we wondered why. PMRA is a building of 300 of the best scientists in the world. Why do you need half a dozen independent scientists to do this? And then lastly, this announcement, as you say, initiated the launch of PMRA's transformation agenda. So with that, Health Canada got I think it was 42 million in government funding over 3 years for a sweeping transformation of the PMRA, which was to focus on several areas.
So like Mac, what are we transforming? Like what are we like that's a pretty broad term, right? It sounds like a whole bunch of Harvard MBA corporate speak that we're finding synergies and we're doing those kinds of things. Like what exactly are they doing?
Yeah, so the initial transformation was to focus on four areas, I guess. So improving transparency at the PMRA, and like I said, the PMRA is one of the most transparent regulators in the rules in the world. So that we question that. They also wanted to increase the use of real world data and independent advice. So some positives there on the real world data side, which I can get into. The maybe some more concern on the independent advice side. They also to strengthen human health and environmental protection through modernizing some of their pesticide business processes, and then also a targeted review of the Pest Controls Product Act. But generally, I would say that on those focus areas, we've prior to transformation, PMRA had a more focused set of operational changes that were widely seen as positive among agriculture stakeholders. So this consisted of efficiency improvements to the backlogged pesticide reevaluation system, better water data so that they could make less risk-averse decisions, and better and earlier consultation with stakeholders on proposed decisions. So that was important as it would allow for better informed proposed reevaluation decisions that are less likely to change because additional data was received. So, those were all on the table before transformation. And now what we're seeing is we were hopeful maybe that some of that would be included in transformation. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is not a lot of that has been reflected in what has been proposed to date.
Yeah, and in January, Real Agri Studies, the market research arm of Real Agriculture, Justin Funk and I asked Canadian farmers, how do you feel, like positively or negatively, about PMRA transformation? And of all the different policies that we asked about, it had the largest, what I would call not really sure answers. May or may not impact my operation. 60% of producers answered that way. And so I think there's a lot of us, including me, trying to sort out what does this really mean. And when you talk about, some like independent, for example, independent scientists, there's a good news, bad news there. That can go multiple ways, right? We could be using more data from out of country when we're looking at registering products, for example, U.S. data, and not having to recreate the wheel, or slow down the registration of products because we need Canadian data. Just that comes to mind. But also, if you search long enough, if you search hard enough, you can find a scientist that will be against something that would be positive for agriculture. There also is a risk here that things grind to a halt and our regulatory system gets even thicker, gets even more of a barrier, a bigger wall in terms of getting products available to Canadian farmers.
Yeah, exactly, Sean. So, we've just come to the end of that initial 3-year funding for transformation, as I discussed, and industry to date has been very engaged in the many consultations that this transformation process has initiated, and it's sort of a good time now to kind of pause and take stock of where we're at with transformation and what needed to be what we feel needs to be prioritized moving forward. And there have been some positive aspects of the transformation agenda to date, but there were aspects of PMRA's regulatory processes that did need to be modernized and improved. But there's also been many aspects and proposals under this initiative that we feel, and as you say, could really jeopardize the PMRA's ability to function as an agile, efficient, and science-based regulator, and in turn could have real negative impacts on access to new crop protection products for Canadian farmers. So, a couple of the good things to come out of transformation that were on the table ahead of transformation was around having a national water monitoring program. So that's something that's moving forward. So essentially, when we go back to the neonic issues that we had back in 2018, right, where essentially they were proposing pulling neonic seed treatments away from Canadian farmers, and essentially we were being I guess, considered guilty until proven innocent at that time.
Right.
So, there was a significant, they're saying, hey, we don't have the data, so we're going to be very conservative in our judgment here. So back on the neonic thing, industry generated a bunch of water data. So at that time and since then, we've wanted better real world data and better water monitoring data so that they can make less risk averse decisions. And so that's something that's moving along well through transformation. But on the concerning side, like I said, there was a big bucket of improvements that we wanted to see that have not been reflected in the current proposals. And really, further than that, we feel that the trajectory that some of these proposals are pointing us towards is really a less predictable, less efficient regulatory system.
Can you give me an
And
example, Mac? What's an example of something you're concerned about?
yeah, so modernizing business practices, for example, is an area that they're hoping to transform. And like I said, prior to transformation, we hope that that would look like better and earlier consultation with stakeholders on proposed decisions. So rather than them coming out with a proposed decision that was, quite a surprise to us, consulting if there is data gaps, if there's any information that we could help refine their assessment as agricultural stakeholders. And so that now the proposals on that have not really reflected those process improvements that we were hoping to see. So, we were hoping that that would allow for a better informed proposed reevaluation decision that's far less likely to change. But what they're proposing is quite high level and really not touching on that as well. Another concerning element, and it's not so much transformation, but it's been enough of a blur over the last 3 years that it's, I think, fair to include it, is PMRA's proposed fee structure and new fee regime. So we know it makes sense to regularly review and update their fee regime, but what we're seeing is the magnitude of the proposed increase in annual fees is something that we feel will disincentivize continued investment into crop protection innovation in Canada and potentially increase costs for Canadian growers. So, you take this all together, we're seeing increase in fees and not real improvements to some of the PMRA processes that were on the table pre-transformation.
And when we talk about fees, who's paying those fees?
So those are the annual charges per product to the product registrants.
And this is again where the word competitive comes into play, right? So how expensive is it to register or maintain that that product in the marketplace? Those fees are a component of that, and they have to be competitive, or they should be, in my mind, competitive to other markets. Canada already deals with the fact that we're limited in size, especially in some of the minor crops. Like you look at pulse crops, right? Or the corn. You look at the amount of corn we have in Canada relative to, say, the state of North Dakota, right? We're relatively small, and so our fees have to be competitive to entice companies to want to do business here. It's not a charity, and I think sometimes that's lost on some people on the government side. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Sean. Like,
Okay.
so for example, the US pesticide market is approximately, 4 times larger than the Canadian pesticide market. So PMRA's proposed fee structure and annual charge per product is going to increase, and it'll result in registrants paying significantly higher product maintenance fees in Canada compared to the fee paid on the same products in the US. And, us being a smaller market, as you say, that means versus the US, that there's less commercial opportunity to absorb those increases. So it's definitely something that is going to have an impact, or if they follow through, will have an impact on the sector's competitiveness and access to innovation. Because cost is obviously a business decision for these multinational companies that are looking to keep a registration or register new products in Canada, but another business decision is the predictability of the regulatory system, and that's where it's a bit of a double whammy with some of the proposals under transformation that are don't have a lot of detail at this point, but we're concerned in the direction that they could move. So you've got maybe higher costs and maybe less predictability in our regulatory system, which ultimately we are concerned could have some impacts on access to products for growers.
Yeah, Pierre Patel, CEO of CropLife Canada, has made this point to me many times. There's a balancing act here, and okay, we're going to have a process to get products to market, but that word you use, predictability, is actually more important than some people actually give it credit for initially, right? We can talk about the thickness of our regulatory system, but is it actually predictable? If you have an ever increasing thickness to the barrier and there's no predictable route to get through those barriers, then you're really creating some problems, and you're keeping products out of the market. So, hey, Mac, thanks so much for joining us here today on Real Ag Radio. We got to have you back because we're going to talk about biodiversity, the biodiversity framework. Well, we'll do that another time. But hey, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Sean. Thanks again.